You are listening to Workplace Stories, a podcast by Red Thread Research about the near future of work.
I'm Stacia Gar, co-founder and principal analyst at Red Thread.
And I'm Danny Johnson, co-founder and principal analyst at Red Thread.
And I'm Chris Pirrie of the Learning Futures Group. And you're listening to Season 6 of Workplace Stories, a season we call The Great Reconnection.
We would like to thank our friends at Torch for sponsoring this podcast season. Torch is the people development platform that fuels leadership development through the power of trusted relationships. By combining coaching, mentoring, and collaborative learning, Torch helps you develop successful leaders aligned with your organization's strategies and values. Visit trch.info for more information.
If you can't wait for more episodes on The Great Reconnection, we have also dropped an early access episode this season. Just head on over to redthreadresearch.com/podcast/early access to hear from Dave Ulrich, who's been called the father of modern HR for his work on organization capability, collaboration, talent management, and culture change.
Join us for a sneak peek of his episode. You don't have to wait till the end of the season. You can actually tune in now at redthreadresearch.com/podcast/early access. In this episode, we talked to Jessica Amortegui, head of learning and culture at Airtable. Danny and I just finished this conversation, and we want to share with you what we thought was most interesting. Danny, what caught your attention? Yeah, what I thought was most interesting is the depth in which she's thinking about connection. She's thinking about it on the individual level, like connecting with you and how you feel about yourself and the situation that you're in, connecting with others one-on-one, connecting with the team, and then connecting with the entire organization. So it's the first time we've heard a leader sort of talk about it in those different levels. And I thought it prompted a really good discussion.
Yeah, I agree too. And we pushed on her on a number of those things around the specific approaches and the resources that she's providing, and honestly, the mindsets that managers have to have. And I thought she had some wonderful answers around even trying to get the skeptics over the line on enabling connection.
I also really like the fact that she took a stand on physical space. So she is in an organization that is largely distributed and pretty remote. And she still talked about the opportunities that she's taking to bring people together to at least have that initial discussion and that initial connection before continuing to build those connections remotely.
And she also emphasized the importance of connection in the flow of one's day-to-day work. So it's not a special thing that you always have to do on the side, but it's 15 minutes in a meeting that you're already having to enable connection, but with some structure, not that you can just expect that it's going to happen. The final thing I want to mention for listeners is she also is sharing some of her resources so that you can do some of the things she mentions in the podcast. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to the wonderful discussion.
Jess, welcome to Workplace Stories, and thanks so much for sharing your insights and your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all.
That's awesome. We like to start each podcast with just a bunch of rapid intro questions to help the audience get to know you and a little bit about your organization. Let's start with, can you give us a quick overview of Airtable's mission and purpose?
So Airtable was created based on a deceptively simple belief that software shouldn't dictate how you work. You should dictate how it works. And so equipped with that ethos, our three co-founders, Howie Liu and Andrew Ofsted and Emmett Nichols, founded Airtable with the mission to democratize software creation for all.
Okay, that's a big mission.
It is a big mission and something that all of us Airtablets rally around and are excited in terms of the impact we're able to have on the world.
Did you call the employees Airtablets?
We did. We do. So that is a kind of some like it, some hate it. I think in some ways it can feel a little bit potentially robotic, but at the same time, I think having a name like that always creates a shared sense of identity. So we're always torn. Like, do we say it? Do we not? And this time it seemed to just come out of my mouth. So
just
I went.
Float right out. Okay.
It did.
well, kind of while we're on the topic of your workforce, because we're talking about connection and leadership and connection to the organization, we'd love to understand just a little bit about Airtable's workforce. Are they hybrid? Are they remote? What are they?
This is actually one of the most fascinating questions as we think about Airtable, because in the spirit of really trying to understand and unpack cultures, Airtable is so unique and can be such an intriguing case study from this perspective. So Given our massive hyper growth, 90% or more of our employees actually joined during the pandemic.
Dang.
Just absolutely, mind blowing to think about that statistic. So what we have is we do have a couple key office hubs that our employees can go into: San Francisco, Mountain View in the Bay Area, as well as Austin in New York City. And then we just recently opened an office in London. That said, we, like all other companies, are experimenting with a hybrid strategy. We like to call ours flexible and connected, trying to optimize for both ends of those spectrums. So we did a soft launch on June 6th. And with that, in looking at the data, we had on average on any given moment, our offices are about 20% capacity. So we still are working in a largely remote and distributed way. And that's with about our now 1,000 employees. So trying to really figure this out of how do we optimize and get that balance? Because I think the flexible thing we're crushing like most companies are, but it's the latter half of that and the connection piece that I think we're still struggling and trying to get our head around.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that, which is why we're doing this season. So we're happy to have you and your insights. Before we jump into the idea of connection, we'd like to know a little bit more about you, though. So tell us a little bit about yourself, what your role is, how you describe your work, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So this is the $1 million question of, God, how do I describe what I do? So title-wise, Head of Learning and Culture at Airtable. What does that mean? At the highest level, I like to think of my job as doing all I can to unsuck the workplace. So creating cultures where people can show up as their best selves and do their best work. Sounds simple, definitely not easy.
Wow. Okay. And how did you get into this line of work?
I feel really lucky with this I know when we think about our career curves and stumbling into where we are today, it's often not a linear path. For me, actually, it was quite linear. I was a major in undergrad, and my senior year, I took a class at the business school through my undergraduate institution called Business in Psychology, and had never even thought of the intersection of those two fields before that. And from that class on, I knew I found an area that would be my calling. And, it have plotted my career ever since that. And that was 23 years ago. And I've dedicated myself to really learning all I can, deepening my craft as an organizational psychologist ever since.
What do you find the most challenging aspect of your work?
It's a double-edged sword, I'd say, working with cultures, because what's so hard about culture and just affecting change, it's not an easy process, right? It takes multiple levers when you're trying to affect culture change. And you have to think through those both systemically and systematically. And, cultures are dynamic. They're constantly evolving. And so designing a culture to get the performance outcomes you desire, you really got to play the long game. There's no overnight solution. There's no panacea. There's no one size fits all. And it takes time. So operating just with a healthy dose of grit and grace and, expectations, and not maybe seeing things move as quickly as you'd like to see them, that's just part of being in this space. So as much as I'm passionate about seeing and creating these thriving workplace cultures, I know that, what goes into making that happen can take a significant amount of time and effort to actually realize the fruits of those labors.
I think it's interesting that you're talking about culture across your employee pool, which is largely remote and hybrid. We've always sort of attributed culture with sort of physical space, and now organizations are having to rethink that. So we're pretty excited to get into how you're doing that and how you're thinking about that more systemically.
Yeah. And this is something I think I go to bed thinking about and I wake up thinking about, and it is on my mind nonstop. So really excited to share the thoughts here as they continue to evolve as we as a workplace evolve.
So let's go with that a little bit more directly, Jess. As you know, this season is all about reconnecting, and particularly the role that leaders play. So can you talk to us about, when you think of this concept of connection, what does that even mean to you?
Yeah, I love this question, and I'm going to harken back a bit to this idea of culture change being on multiple levels, because in requiring multiple levers, because I believe the same is true of connection. And so when I think of connection and I think of really fostering and cultivating these kind of bonds and connections we're after, I look at it on a few different levels. And the first level here is individual connection, right? It starts with connection to myself. What am I feeling, needing, and wanting right now? I can only give as much empathy and compassion to others that I give to myself. So the first person I need to connect to is me. We can talk about that and how do we do that in a workplace, right? I mean, that's one. Then we move to the next level, and this is at the dyadic level, right? It's with someone else. It's an interpersonal connection, right? And so for this form of connection, I really like to think of it in terms of how Brené Brown defines it. She describes a connection. When it exists between two people, how do we know? So that it's the energy that exists between you and someone else when you feel seen, heard, and valued, and when you can give and receive without judgment and then derive strength from that relationship. And the piece I want to rotate and index on that I think is so instrumental in a workforce is without judgment. And, I think if you look at organizations, what are we so good at? We're good at problem solving. We're good at critiquing. We're good at putting out fires, right? This requires amount of judgment. When do we turn that off to connect? And I think that's not easy.
And I think that's especially the case when you're talking about managers doing the connecting.
For sure. And I don't want to give engineers a bad rap, but engineers too. I mean, they thrive on this ability to poke holes and find problems, right? You bring that into a relationship and that can be challenging. That can actually get in the way of connection. So we've got an individual level we start with. We move to the dyadic level. Then we have a team level, incredibly important, right? So at that team level, how do I connect with a group of individuals where I have safety, a climate of interpersonal risk-taking, right? Where I feel like I belong. I feel like I matter to this team. I feel like my strengths and contributions are being utilized. They're being seen. They're being noticed, and they matter. Ideal state, everyone on a team feels like they belong and what they're doing is critical to the team's success. And the last level is to connect with the company, right? So I want to be part of something that's bigger than myself. Every person wants to feel that they're in it not just for their own self-interest. There's got to be something larger. And this idea of purpose and being purpose-driven, to feel connected to the company's mission, to be proud to be part of this company, what it's doing in the world, and that I am playing some part in that, no matter how small, of bringing this to life, that's that last level of connection. And so as we unpack connection in this new world we're living in, we have to start to think of how do we really activate the levers across those 4 different points of connection.
The thing I think is interesting here is often we group together your middle 2 levers. So we often group together the dyadic and the team levels into just your personal, interpersonal connections. But I think it's interesting that you have divided between those 2. As you think particularly about this concept of connection and that dyadic one-to-one relationship, as you think about that and you think about fostering it, is there a group of leaders who you think an individual should consider more their connection with? So as an example, in some research on engagement, it's like, do you have a best friend at work? So that might be one of them, or another might be actually your manager. So is there an important subset of one-to-one relationships?
Well, interesting enough, I think there's a set of relationships that fuel me and that inspire my growth in development that I need. So I think when you think about mentors or sponsors or advocates, someone who's really in the organization and has my back, is invested in me, that is key. But when I look at what do I need to do the work, what one-on-one relationships matter there, and what we continually see and where I think most organizations are struggling is with the cross-functional relationship. In the social capital research, we call this the difference between bonding and bridging capital, right? Bonding, we found, actually went up in the pandemic, like those relationships with those who are close to me that I already had established with my team and others. But when we look at the latter, the need to be able to bridge that social capital, and I need that to get my work done, that has significantly decreased. So if I were to step back and say, hey, what connections matter most? I would say, how do we start to foster more of that bridging capital so we can start to feel like we're connected to those pieces and silos in the organization that's going to facilitate the quality of work and the ability to be able to do that work in a more coordinated, orchestrated, and fulfilling manner.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about work design and hybrid and how we address that in just a minute. But before we go there, we think this concept of connection is so important. I mean, that's why we decided to do a season on it. But why do you think it's important?
Having studied and having a master's in positive psychology, if you were to say, Jess, will you sum up what makes a good life for me? Tell me in one sentence. If I were to say, I want to live my best life and look out the end with no regrets, what is that? And you could wake up any social psychologist in the middle of the night and say, tell me, what's the key to a good life? And they're all going to say the same thing. Connection and relationships. Relationships matter. And as we take that and we bring that in even into the workplace, right? Is that one of the most important things? I undeniably think that is one of the most important things that fuels our sense of belonging, commitment, pride, loyalty, all engagement, all these outcomes that we're looking to engender. And so that is at its core. And I love the work by Matthew Lieberman, a social scientist who wrote the book Social. And he even argues based on his research that Maslow actually that's an outdated pyramid in terms of like what we need for sustenance in life, that the bottom actually isn't even food and shelter. It's actually connection. You think about that and you're like, okay, well, that shifts us. Because if a job now is no longer about providing financial freedom and allowing us to live the life and buy the things we want, actually a job at the bottom of the base is actually about connection, belonging, inclusivity. Like that's a game changer in terms of how we think about prioritizing this, that it's actually essential to our livelihood. It's not a nice to have. We must have it.
Interesting point. But I might counter that the idea that a job isn't necessary for our sustenance and livelihood probably applies to a subset of employees, and particularly those at the top in terms of income. So how does this then play out differently as you think about connection for, let's say, frontline workers who may be living paycheck to paycheck versus those who are in the center or the corporate suite?
And to some degree, yes, because, if we look at the research, and so I don't want to understand, we look at the research around happiness, right? There is a point of around $75,000 per year. Economists found, right? That's what we need for our own sense of well-being. So I want to anchor and say there is to an extent, right? But once we get at that 75K, it's no longer about money. And so I do want to counter challenge a little bit of even a frontline worker. And even, there's research by Amy Resnesky out of Yale and Jane Jutton out of University of Michigan. What they had found is that when we look at our work, we can look at it in three ways. And only one of those ways actually gives us a sense of meaning. And so the three different types of work orientations are, we can have a job, which is, it gives us what we need in terms of pay. It affords us to do the things that we want to do, right? To live the life we want, to your point. We can also look at a job, right, as a career. This is how most of us look at it, right? We want to grow, we want to develop, we want to excel in our career. We want to see ourselves having movement and achievement. And the last is a calling, where our job is actually a form of kind of self-expression. It's a palette for me to be able to express myself. And in looking at these three forms of orientation, this is what I want to say from the research. It was not attached to level. So you don't have more people at the top who find themselves having a calling than you do at the bottom. And in fact, the research they did was in a hospital setting, and they found just as many janitors saw their job as a calling as did doctors. And so this idea that a job can bring us more than just pay and money, and that can happen at all levels, is fundamentally counterintuitive to, I think, how we think about work, but brings light at every level. People do want more.
Can we dive in there just a little bit? Stacia and I have this ongoing conversation about what is the responsibility of an organization these days. Is it to provide the food and the clothing, and that's the extent of their responsibility, or do they have a responsibility to build this idea of community and this idea of connection? And if they don't, which we haven't come down anywhere on that yet, but if they don't, then what is the benefit to a role like yours where you're actively trying to build that connection?
Obviously, I'm in a biased place to say that if you go to a workplace and to take no responsibility for creating an inclusive culture, a culture where people feel seen, valued, heard, feel like people feel like they can contribute, feels a very void. If you're going to spend the majority of your life working, feels like a very empty and hollow place that I don't know I would want to be, a part of, to just clock in and clock out and be done. So if that is the kind of culture someone says, you know what, we're just here to do work, and that's the kind of place I want to create, great. People can self-select into that. Do I think that that would be the most meaningful way to be able to spend my working days? No. Do I think that for most they would find the same? Agree? Yes. And so let's presume the latter, that now we're saying culture is in fact really important to the workplace, that I want to go into a place where I feel like I can be authentic, where I feel seen for my true self, where I feel like I matter, where I get a sense of pride, fulfillment in the work. Then you say, well, then how do we design a culture so the majority, because I don't think it's possible for all, the majority truly feel that, where they actually feel energized. They wake up and said, I want to go to work today. It gives me more. The thing that I would love to switch about our workplaces is how many of us end the day exhausted and feeling de-energized. Why does it have to be that way?
Yeah. And we agree. Like, I don't think anybody wants to work in an organization that I described just a minute ago. Like, I think most organizations are striving to build this idea of community. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, why are they doing it? I would love to believe in altruistic organizations, and I think that there are more of them coming up, but we live in a capitalist society, right? And so there has to be a business reason for doing those types of things. And so particularly within Airtable, like, what have you seen as you've built this culture and fostered these connections? What have you seen as the business benefits of doing that?
I think here the research is pretty unambiguous in terms of we tend to use the metric of engagement. Right. And then we know engagement feeds productivity and bottom line, all the stats around shareholder returns and profit. And, we can directly connect engagement to the bottom line. So we know that. And so there's benefit there of being able to directly see that tie. But I think other than that, what is the real compelling case for building culture in organizations is a fundamental belief that creating workplaces where people find a sense of meaning and fulfillment is an endeavor on into its own. It's for its own sake. That's the kind of workplace that we want to see more of in this world, that we want people to find that kind of fulfillment and enjoyment, to be part of something that feels like a thriving culture. And so I would argue now, and I think the same is kind of true as we look at the case for diversity, inclusion, and belonging, that the moral case in and of itself is becoming sufficient enough. Like, we don't have to keep continually saying, here's the bottom line result. People get it. And so I do think.
But do they? Jess, like, I don't want to argue with you here, but I'm interested, especially because the power structures or the power balance is shifting right now. You know what I mean? We're seeing all kinds of layoffs and a shift in power. So employees don't have the type of power that they had in the past. And we're seeing Meta and Tesla and all these organizations who, for the last couple of years have preached, do what's good for you and blah, 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 blah. All of a sudden they're saying things like back in the office, 40 to 45 hours a week, the end. And so I'm wondering, like, I want to believe your vision. I do. I really want to believe it. But when it comes down to it, as the economy continues to maybe contract a little bit, do you think we'll continue to see that stuff? Or, do you think we'll continue to see that altruism? Or do you think some of that other stuff is going to creep back in?
When we look at like the Teslas in making those decisions, I don't think they're making those decisions with thinking that they're doing it in a way that's counter to their culture. I think they feel like those decisions are aligned to the culture they want to build. That would be just one take. Is it may not be a culture that I agree with or that someone else agrees with, but it's still a move to align to a culture they desire. And so in that culture is one of productivity and accountability and results. And they believe the way in doing that is to get people collaboratively together in the office. And so that's a choice point. I'm not sure it's necessarily a sign that they're not investing in their culture. I don't think I would maybe put it that from that perspective. I actually think it's a signal of the culture that they value and want to create for themselves in designs. And I think, the reality is the economy shrinks. If there's business needs to be able to do layoffs, there's also a way to do that with compassion. And there's a way to do that still preserves the culture. And there's a way to do that isn't. So I don't think it's necessarily the choice of, if we have to, if the economy constricts, we have to make tough choices. That's fine. It's how we do it that affects the culture, not the fact that we're doing it.
Those are some interesting points. And I want to dive in a little bit more because in our prep call, we talked about how culture and connection are obviously connected. Can you then talk about how you see that varying based on the organization's type of culture? So we just used the Tesla example, and I have to insert just a little footnote here, which is that Tesla dragged its feet on allowing people to work from home. And I don't think there was any greater, you do what's good for you approach at that organization. No disrespect to them, but that was not their leadership style. But as we think about connection and how that connection varies, how have you seen that, Jess? I know you're relatively new to Airtable. You were at LinkedIn before that. So can you talk a little bit from your experience about how connection might vary based on organizational culture?
I always think internal cultures are also a reflection of their kind of external products, right? So, and I say that with the example of I'll go to LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn has a product that's based on connection. So it's no surprise that when you step in the four walls of LinkedIn, you see that premium and priority put on it. In fact, one of their values is relationships matter. So what is something that they do to be able to bring that to life? And so one of the things that they had that still in awe of in terms of what it was able to do for their cultures, once a month, they have what they call in days. So this is a day that's given back to employees to connect with themselves, to connect with their teams, LinkedIn, and to connect with their communities around them. And each day had a guiding theme that really centered on one of LinkedIn's cultures and values. So there was learning in day, compassion in day, gratitude in day, creativity in day, and so on and so forth. So you started to see that day was really, if you step back, just a moment to say, we are intentionally going to connect at all of those levels. And I talked about earlier in the podcast. So you can start to see that as part of it. So I think as we think about connection and how that's connected to culture, you can start to see these linkages. And so the importance of connection, I think very few are not talking about right now in a hybrid world, and all are trying to say, how do we maintain it? And I think the lens, though, that we're looking through is just the office, right? Is that we somehow believe that an office is the place where this has to happen. And I think what we need to step back and say is, yes, face-to-face connection is important. And how do we actually get that right? But there's a lot we can do in a virtual world, too, to start fostering and engendering greater connection. And we can pull both of those levers simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I was recently listening to Adam Grant's podcast, and he had a guest on it. Apologies, I cannot remember her name, but she said something that I think gets really to what you're saying here, which is that we need to start envisioning the office as a tool and digital tools as destinations, which I think is an interesting kind of way to flip how we're thinking about where connection happens.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I think, at its core, I think that's what we're all trying to crack too, is not only thinking of them both differently, but thinking about the optimal balance that each company needs to be able to get at that. And I think that looks different for each company.
Let's talk a little bit about the responsibility of the organization for connection. versus managers and individual leaders. A lot of the conversation around connection is, managers need to make sure that they're connecting. Managers need to facilitate the connection, et cetera. But as Danny mentioned a few moments ago, we believe very strongly in the responsibility of organizations to set up systems and practices that enable the right types of behaviors. So as you think about this, what do you think is the responsibility of the organization to enable connection?
I think it is a both and. It's not an either or. And I think you can't just have it reside with the manager without having a broader organizational kind of support mechanisms in place. And so one of the things that we do at Airtable is we dedicate, every team has a dollar amount that they can spend per quarter, per employee, to be able to bring individuals together for on-site connection and whatever that looks like for them. Now I'm going to play, great. So how do you ensure people get together and actually connection happens? And so what we've built at Airtable is a team playbook. And the team playbook has a series of different exercises around psychological safety, trust building, building norms, understanding each other's kind of personal user guides and how they interact with each other. All of these tools that actually foster greater connection between one another in the work. I give those two examples because you can start to see how important it is to have both in place. You have the support to come together, but then as a team, you have the tools to be able to ensure you optimize for the time together. And so 1 + 1 suddenly equals 4 when you have those both in place. And so that's an example. I think we're starting to see you need the support of both to be able to make this happen.
Let's talk about the role of managers now. We talked just now about organizations. Let's move on to managers. And you mentioned, some of the tools and resources. So what are those tools and resources driving towards? What types of behavior are they trying to enable?
I do think that putting tools in the hands of managers is absolutely essential. In most instances, they are trying to enable a sense of trust and psychological safety, a sense of vulnerability with one another. And so I can talk about a few tools that we use. It's so simple, but very impactful in terms of driving these outcomes. So one, in terms of even modeling vulnerability, we do an exercise called 7-minute stories. And it is absolutely surprising what happens at the end of this interaction, which is you get with another individual and you have 7 minutes to share your life from when you were born and your earliest memory to where you are today. I get people who don't even work with each other that frequently to do this. And then I tell a manager, how many of you now know this stranger better than you know any of your direct reports? Nearly 100% of the time, I get everyone to raise their hand. In 7 minutes, that's all it took to really foster that sense of vulnerability and connection, being seen not just as an employee, but being seen as a human. So things like that. The other thing that I really advocate for is something we call the mood meter. It's shows 100 of the most common emotions we experience in the workplace. And when I think of a really valuable tool, and especially given the things that we've been going through in the past couple of years, is how do we start to say, not just I'm good or I'm okay, but how am I feeling? This gives me permission when I look at this mood meter to say, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling burnt out. It allows it, as we say, like in the research, name it to tame it. It brings people together to talk in vulnerable ways about what's going on for them. Mm-hmm. So even that alone, we've got some exercises around trust building that really bring it to life. We have a way for teams to be able to set up team norms, which is just being very explicit. How do we want to show up for each other? What does great look like? If you've been on a high-performing team, what does that look like? Now, how do we make that happen for us? And just being very explicit about how we're going to act and interact with one another. So series of very small exercises like this that add up to have a huge impact on the overall team's dynamics and cohesion.
Do you ever get pushback to some of these exercises where they're being asked to share maybe more than they're comfortable with?
So that's a great one. Here's how I like to set that up. First, I will say no. I haven't gotten pushback, but I think people are very good about knowing what's safe and what kind of selectively disclose, right? I mean, I think knowing your own boundaries, I would say. But to bring it to life, I do introduce something called the 15% rule. Was actually something that was in the book Connect by, I believe her name is Carol Robin, out of the touchy-feely class, quote unquote, at Stanford, that many claim on the interpersonal dynamics who have gone through it as, a transformative experience for them. And the 15% rules, I want you to imagine 3 concentric circles here. And the first one is your comfort zone, right? Is where you feel safe. The second is just slightly outside your comfort zone. I like to call it 15%. Just push yourself. Give yourself that little nudge. And the last concentric circle is right. That's where it's danger. That's over pushing. That's when you over disclose and now you compromise the safety. What does the 15% rule look like for you? That's kind of the limit. And what we know about vulnerability is that it happens like jumping into a pool. Like we don't like to dive in, right? We dip our toes in and then we go a little bit further. We kind of incrementally acclimate, and vulnerability works the very same way. So when we tee these up, we need to be able to create kind of incremental levels of vulnerability to be able to make that happen. And the 15% rule, that's usually allows us to establish that. And what ends up happening after 15%, if someone receives that and sends it back, then you go another 15%. And then it moves to another 15%. And that's how you end up kind of building under the umbrella of keeping it safe.
So you mentioned, Jess, that your workforce is largely distributed and remote and hybrid. Some of the examples you've provided us are about bringing people together physically. Mm-hmm. Have you thought through how you help managers make connections with their direct reports that maybe can't get together physically, or longer term, how you build that over time when they can't be in the same space, breathing in the same air?
I know it's not always possible, but I do think it's important to try and have those moments, even if they're limited, of physical connection. And then you can kind of go a long time with being remote and distributed, but you have that foundation you built. And so even if it's a one-time thing or when it's comfortable, to be able to have that where you actually have the mirror neurons, you just have a different level that happens in when you're face to face. Now that said, right, let's assume that it's not viable and you have to do everything remotely. Nearly everything I've talked about, from 7-minute stories to the mood meter to a lot of the trust exercises, that can still happen in a distributed workforce. You can still do this over Zoom. That's what we've been doing for the past 2.5 years, and, have seen great results with it. I don't think it has limited us to the extent that originally that we thought it would going into this pandemic, thinking that being able to create these bonds. And, I'm back to the research that even shows like those around us, it strengthened our bonding capital. We became closer with those who were in our direct team. So I don't think any of these can't be done in a virtual setting. Now, I will say, and, kind of back to this is, at Airtable back in May, we did a leadership summit. So we brought all of our senior leaders together for the first time. And that experience, hands down, 99.8% of people said that was a worthwhile time investment. And what we gained in that still pays dividends in terms of now being able to continue and sustain that in our distributed environment and hybrid environment. So we created that base and that foundation, and everyone walked away feeling and a reminder of how powerful that face-to-face connection truly is.
So Stacia and I are all about systems, and we're also all about fixing the work rather than adding things. Have you thought through maybe how your culture absorbs some of these behaviors so that they happen automatically, like the way that you structure a meeting or the way that feedback is given or other things? And so it's not necessarily a separate activity, although I do agree they're valuable. It's not a separate activity, but it's basically the way we do things that help us build connection in the context of the work that we do.
This, I think, is the key point here. Is for things to happen, they have to be built into systems already in place and become habitualized. And so I actually think that that's one of the only ways to be able to drive change. So some of the things that I was talking about is how do you start a one-on-one with the mood meter or with the check-in? We do a daily check-in question for all team meetings. So we have a Go Icebreaker site where you can spin a wheel and it has different connection questions. And so advocate starting meetings and be able to in those ways. And so any places where we can seamless into the very nature of the work, these touch points is absolutely essential, because I think that you are right. When they are outside of the work, it feels like more work. And so we need to build it into what's already there and what's already present. So every moment we can to be able to do that. And as we kind of think about those daily rhythms and routines, we try and really bake those in to be able to bring that level of effortlessness to making it happen.
There is so much here that I feel mirrors some of my different experiences. And one of them is when I was in business school, I took a class that was really about telling great stories, and telling those great stories started with you. So each of us had to tell a story. And I would argue that the lecturers pushed us way beyond the 15% circle. But there is often a high degree of skepticism, a sense that this is going to be cheesy, and I'm not thinking just of the 15% example, because we've talked a little bit about that. But as you think about these different ways to enable connection, and in so many ways enable vulnerability, how do you balance that sense of the skeptics saying, are you kidding me? With the people who are maybe a bit more enthusiastic about having that connection?
The way I like to think of it too, and I'll tell you what I've seen from my experiences, in some ways these exercises are a little bit like going to the gym, where you hear it and you dread it, and then afterwards you feel so good. And I will say, undeniably, that is my experience with some of these that may feel quote unquote more cheesy, is they get a little cringeworthy going in. There's a little bit of anxiety, or I don't know. And then afterwards, what people feel, how they feel refueled, how they feel reinvigorated, how they feel re-energized, that is almost inevitable once you have a shared experience of connection and vulnerability. And so if you can get people to just dip their toes and have that experience, then they want more of it. And I'll say, having even rolled out the 7-minute story, we did one recently with the team that we called the 3 H's, where they got in groups of 4 or 5, and they talked about a hope, a heartbreak, and a hero. And afterwards there was tears, but what the group walked away with in terms of a shared moment that was just so poignant in terms of how we touch them individually and collectively as a team was so powerful. And then you know what? They wanted more. What else that feeling? It's like, it's in some ways, I think it is like this drug for us. When we experience it, like, what else can I do? I want to feel that again. We all want to feel that. And so I think is the hump is actually getting the skepticism is just getting someone to try it, to start to put themselves in there. And what they walk away with is things to say, now, how can I keep that going? What else do you have for me is what I've seen. So, yeah.
Let's talk for a moment. And I know we're starting to run short on time, but let's talk for a moment. How do you help managers do these things? I know you touched on them, there should be resources and guides, but talk to us a little bit about what's actually in those, because particularly if I'm a skeptic manager and then you're telling me I need to have these conversations with my team, like, okay, how do I get over that hump?
I think one is the easiest way I'll say this is if you as a manager experienced it with your manager, now we have this leadership shadow effect going on, right? Now I experience with my manager, I pass it down, which is one way to say, how do you start to get our more senior level leaders doing this? Because that's going to naturally model and be cascaded down the organization. So that's kind of one piece of it. The other element is just, in a more formalized way, we have this in our manager development program. So we have 2 manager development programs at Airtable, one for new managers and one for more seasoned managers. In there, we have concepts around psychological safety, belonging, connection, authenticity, vulnerability, boundaries. I could go on and on, but we're teaching them the skills and we're creating a practice space for them to be able to to apply it so they have the confidence to bring this to the team and know that they can get the outcomes they want with it. So I think that's the other pillar of it. So the modeling of it, the making it part there, and then just making these tools really easy and accessible. You know, and so the easier it can be, like something like that, as simple as a 7-minute story, you're not going into if I'm a skeptic, it's not affecting my time and productivity. You're just telling me, hey, set aside 15 minutes in a meeting to do this. Right. So one of the things that we've created just to create that sense of ease and support is this team playbook. It has Jamboards. It has detailed note for note facilitation guide of here's what to say, here's how to do it. So we're giving people kind of the fake it till you make it. Just follow this script and do it. Don't think about it. Don't get too much in your head about it. Go make it a recipe. And I think that's okay. If I have to spell it out one by one, if a manager feels slightly more robotic doing it, as long as they're getting in and doing it, that's what matters. And so when you think about that, of kind of making it easy, building it into their development in a very formal and systemic way, and then modeling it from above, then I think you've got everything in place to make it happen.
And I would add, there's nothing like results to get managers to do things too. So what kind of results have you seen?
That is precisely right. And so some of the things that we're looking at too is just trying to get at the data and understand, like, when we touch our managers in this way, are they producing better results? So when they go through our manager development programs, do we see higher engagement? What else in terms of business outcomes do we see with these managers versus a pilot group? And I think, starting to get in metrics like this is important, and trying to run experiments and see what's working and what's not. And so we're trying to do the same with our team playbook of those who've accessed it. Do we see different results? And so we are looking kind of from a data and analytics perspective to see if we can start to just tell stories around that, because that's compelling to a manager. I can say managers who went through this program actually saw X, Y, and Z in terms of the results, the productivity on the team, the accountability on the team, the bottom line results they were able to deliver, if we're able to capture that. If it's a sales team in terms of quota attainment, that's compelling. Now you've given them a reason to want to be able to do that. But it starts with being able to step back and say, what can we do in terms of connecting this data to really the outcomes people care about?
And I think you've seen some compelling numbers. I think you mentioned a 93% number that we were
going to talk about. I think it was, and I think it was the high 80s or low 90s. Around that range we had, which I just blows my mind in terms of an item that we had on our employee voice survey around manager care. It's a number that I'm so proud of at Airtable, to think that nearly all employees said they agreed that their manager cared about them as a human being. Who doesn't want to be part of that culture? Who doesn't want to join? I mean, we talk about people obviously not leaving a company and leaving a manager. If you believe your manager cares about you as a human, that's getting to kind of a next level in terms of how you experience your work and how you experience that team dynamic. And so just a phenomenal number that I think is just a testament to the skill, the vulnerability, and just the astute ability to be able to create a space for our manager, for their teams, where people feel seen.
This has been a fantastic conversation, and I've personally learned a lot. I'm probably one of those skeptics that Stacia was talking about. It's not easy for me to share. And so it's been enlightening to talk to you and kind of hear what you're doing at Airtable. As we sort of wrap up, I want to end with two questions. The first one is, you're much further down the path than a lot of organizations that are trying to build connection. What's your best first step advice to managers or people leaders that are trying to figure this out?
Start small. That is advice that I have. Okay. Make it easy to enact small changes, and they will add up. You could ask all your teams to start with a connection question in their team meetings, for example. Provide a tool for managers or teams to create team norms. Provide the dollar amount per quarter for each person to come together and foster connection. Whatever is easiest in your culture, right? Start there, and that's half the battle.
It's kind of interesting that none of those things cost a lot of money either. So this isn't a big financial lift on the organization to change some of these behaviors either.
Not at all.
And then the final question that we ask everybody that's on our podcast is, why do you do what you do?
Yeah, it's fulfillment of affecting change, to see that in some small way, people's lives are positively affected. That's just so meaningful to me. And so if I can play a part in someone feeling like they're having a better experience at work, where they feel more authentic, where they feel like they can show up, be themselves, and do work that really matters, even if it's just 1, 2, 3 people who see that shift in an organization, to me, that's worth it.
That's a good answer. Jess, thanks again for being with us today and for being so open and honest with us and for sharing your experiences as well as some of the things that you're doing at Airtable.
And also, I think you mentioned you're going to share some resources with our listeners.
Oh, right.
So thanks for that.
Yes, I will pass those along, from 7-minute stories to the mood meter to some other things I mentioned around vulnerability. I'll provide those tools so you can go ahead and pass those along to listeners so they have them to be able to put them in action at their respective companies.
That's amazing.
Thank you. That's so generous. Thank you.
So excited to do so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Had a ton of fun. Appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Workplace Stories. Danny and Stacia, how can listeners get more involved in the podcast and, of course, with your great work?
Well, they can follow Workplace Stories by Red Thread Research on the podcast platform of your choice. And you can go to ratethispodcast.com/workplace stories and leave us ratings and reviews.
You can also share this or your favorite episode with a colleague or a friend.
You can check out our website at redthreadresearch.com to follow all of our latest trends in people practices and sign up to participate in some of our research.
Or Stacia, they could maybe
sign up for our weekly newsletter at redthreadresearch.com/newsletter and consider joining the Red Thread community by joining our membership.
And lastly, we're on Twitter at RedThreadRe. That's RedThreadRe. Or look up Red Thread Research on LinkedIn and follow our work.
And thanks so much for listening.
We would like to thank our friends at Torch for sponsoring this podcast season. Torch is the people development platform that fuels leadership development through the power of trusted relationships. By combining coaching, mentoring, and collaborative learning, Torch helps you develop successful leaders aligned with your organization's strategy and values. Our customers deliver compelling leadership development experiences to their employees in support of their strategic initiatives. These include high-potential programs, new manager onboarding, DEI change management, and others. The result is increased employee engagement, retention, and performance. Visit trch.info/redthread for more information. Workplace Stories is a production of Red Thread Research and the Learning Futures Group. Thanks for listening.